if YouTube live.
Yeah, maybe we'll give 1-2 minutes because it is clashing with our launch time little bit.
Yeah, sure, yes, of course.
2-3 minutes.
So you've been doing this as an IIT-wide program, or the Nobels?
Yes, sir. So as in part of our outreach activity. So
Yeah.
this is the second year of this event.
Okay.
Okay, I think Ruchi, we have got to start. So good afternoon to all the viewers on WebEx and YouTube. And it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Ravi Srivastav today for Economic Sciences Nobel Prize in 2021. And on behalf of our outreach team, International Affairs and Outreach Office, and also the organizing committee of this special event, so I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Srivastava, and I hand over to my friend Ruchi Sharma to chair the session with the introduction of Professor Srivastava. Ruchi, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahu. So as a very good afternoon to everybody. As Dr. Sahu mentioned, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, they awarded the Sverges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences with one half to Professor David Card, University of California, Berkeley, particularly for his empirical contributions to labor economics, and the other half jointly to Professor Joshua Angeles from MIT, USA, and Professor Imbens of Stanford University for their methodological contribution to the analysis of causal relationships. So with the last two Nobel laureates in economics, evidently natural experiments have gained prominence in developing insights about the causal relations in economics. In that context, the key is to identify and use the situations in which chance events or policy change result in groups of people being treated differently in a way that resembles clinical trial in medicine. Accordingly, and very interestingly, today's talk on Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences 2021 is titled The Role of Natural Experiment in Unnatural Social Science, for which we have with us very eminent Professor Ravi Srivastav. So first of all, thank you very much, sir, for agreeing to be part of this event of IIT Indore. Professor Srivastav is currently Director, Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, Delhi. He received his education in the University of Allahabad, Delhi School of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and University of Cambridge, UK. His main areas of research and publication include labor and employment, migration, social protection, agriculture, rural development, rural poverty, informal sector, regional development, human development, and labor reform. He has published 6 books, 5 monographs, and more than 135 papers, and carried out more than 35 research projects sponsored by various agencies, including UNICEF, ILO, World Bank, and University Grants Commission, ICSSR, Shastri Indo-Canadian Foundation, and other. He is a recipient of numerous awards and scholarships, including the Commonwealth and Fulbright Fellowship, the UGC Commission's Award in Economics for Innovative Research on Poverty, and V.V. Giri Memorial Award in 2009 for research on labor migration. He was earlier Professor of Economics and Chairperson, Center for Study of Regional Development, JNU, and full-time member of National Commission for Enterprises in Unorganized Sector in the rank of Secretary, Government of India. He's former chairman of Institute of Development Study, Jaipur. He has been member and chairperson of number of committees of UGC, Planning Commission, ICISA, and also member of governing boards, academic council, executive council, and board of studies of a number of universities and institutes. He has performed consultancy and advisory role for Planning Commission, Indian ministries, state government, and international agencies like World Bank, ILO, ADP, UNDP, UNICEF, and the list goes on. And he's a past president of Indian Society of Labor Economics and current president of UP and Uttarakhand Economic Association. So before we begin, I would like to inform that we'll take the questions after the talk. Now I request for somebody to Professor Srivastava to take over and start the lecture. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Ruchi. Thanks for this introduction. How long do you want me to take?
We can go about 30 to 40 minutes and then we can have a 20 minutes of a question answer session.
30 to 40 minutes. I think that should be fine. So you can see me and hear me?
Yes, sir. If you wish to present a PPT?
No, there is no PPT.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay. So, well, first of all, I hope you're all well. You know, we are going through this third COVID upsurge. And certainly in and around Delhi, we are, you know, this upsurge is huge just now. So best wishes to all of you. Thank you for organizing this lecture. Well, in brief, you know, Ruchi gave a long introduction of me, but in brief, basically, I'm a development economist and a labor economist. I spent many years, actually, last few years, looking very closely at questions of labor. And that's one reason why the Nobel Prizes this year interest me a lot. As Ruchi has already told you, the Nobel Prize this year was shared between David Card, who's best known as a labor economist, although he's worked a great deal also on other areas, the economics of education and the economics of So, can you mute the person? Yeah. So David Card, who's from the University of California, Berkeley, and who shared half the prize this year. And then Joshua Angrist from MIT. Joshua Angrist works mostly on problems relating to the economics of education. And Guido Imbens from Stanford University, who's basically an applied econometrician. So the other half of the prize was shared between Angrist and Imbens. But of course, all of them have a lot in common. They have worked with each other at some point or another. And they've also worked with other groups of economists who have made a great deal of contribution to this area that we are going to talk about today, which is basically the area of causality. So, you know, as economists, just to first, let me, you know, give you first a broad introduction to the Nobel in economics, to those of you who are not from economics. As you perhaps know, that the Nobel in economics was not part of the will of Alfred Nobel. It was instituted in 1968 by the Sverige Bank. So the prize actually comes from the bank itself. It has had a more checkered and a more, let's say, controversial history than other prizes, partly because it was not initially part of the will of Alfred Nobel, partly because there have been periods of time when the incumbents to the prize, those who have been awarded the prize, have been treated with a fair degree of controversy from time to time. The other distinction, of course, between the Nobel Prize in economics and the Nobel Prize in other areas is that the Nobel Prize in economics has not always been awarded to economists. In fact, since it was awarded in 1978 to Herbert Simon, who was a political scientist. It has subsequently also been awarded to John Nash for his contributions to game theory. It has been awarded to psychologists and so on. So basically, although it is a prize which is given for economic sciences, other contributions in social sciences which have had a seminal impact on economic sciences have also been included in the prize from time to time. The controversies which have been around the Nobel Prize have been around individuals who have won the Nobel Prize, because inevitably the Nobel is in the realm of social sciences, and social sciences is a far more contested domain than physics or mathematics or biology, etc. Uh, so that also has given rise to controversies around individuals who have actually got this prize. Uh, Having said that, this year's Nobel Prize has gone to an area which is basically looking at causal research, and the implications of looking at this, and this is interdisciplinary. So basically trying to find out basically looking at causal research, uh, mm, looking at causal relationships and methodological issues around causal relationships is something which has been an important concern in economics for a long time. Economics centrally has been around contributions. Basically, cause and effect has been a very important issue in economics, as it has been in other social science disciplines. Uh, but in the till and in the field of econometrics within economics has had a great deal to do with looking at cause and effect, on an empirical basis. But in the 70s and 80s, the models, the specifications that were used as models in econometrics were not considered robust enough. And there was a lot of controversy and a lot of skepticism around empirical work in economics. Um, this strand of causal, the strand of research in causal relationships to which David Card and Angres and Invens and various other contributed was in some sense a fix to that controversy. So they tried to develop methodological issues which could set at rest some of the controversies around this whole area, although I must say that those controversies have not ceased to exist. The other important issue, of course, is that although their contributions have been broadly to economic issues, the analysis of causal relationships and the impact of their own work is not restricted to economics, because the whole domain of causal relationships is very interdisciplinary, and it has been looked at within the realm of psychology, mathematics, law, biology, epidemiology, and so on. So this is a broader area, and their contribution also has had impact on this broader area. So let me just try to give you a gist of what they have tried to do and why they have tried to do it. So essentially, when when we want to look at cause and effect, the problem is if something changes. So supposing there's an exogenous change, and we want to map the effect of that change. Uh, Essentially, if we have a before and after kind of scenario, we know what would have happened, what was the scenario when change had not occurred, and what is then the scenario when the change has occurred. The difference should ideally give us the impact of that change. However, it is not that simple, because there would be various other confounding relationships uh, due to which the change, the outcome that we are measuring, would not necessarily be due to the change, the exogenous kind of variable which has been introduced. So there is a problem in how do we measure this change, and the exact counterfactual doesn't always exist. So the real question is, how do you create a counterfactual, or whether in theory or methodologically, against which you can measure the change due to an exogenous change. And this exogenous change typically in economics would take the form of a policy change. So if there is some kind of a policy change, how do you measure its impact? Uh, Now, one way of doing it is what was due to Fisher and his counterparts in the 1920s, and that is that came that 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 methodology came to be known as randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials were used in the areas of medicine and epidemiology uh, since the 1960s. Randomized controlled trials are fairly simple to understand in design, because what you do is that you have a random design. You allocate a treatment to a random group, and the remaining group is really the control group, and you are able to then study the impact of this treatment on the treatment group. So if you are looking at the impact of a particular treatment regimen or a drug, what you do is that you take a group and you randomly assign the treatment to a subgroup within that group, and the remaining group then becomes the control group, and then you examine the effect of that treatment or that drug, and then you compare it with the control group, which is given a placebo. And by making this comparison, you are able to actually understand whether this drug is effective, or what is the nature of the effectiveness of this drug. Now, this is a methodology which has also been adopted in economics, and in fact, 2 years ago, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Kremer won a Nobel Prize for their contributions to randomized controlled trials. Now, the problem with the randomized controlled trials is, first of all, they have to be, they're expensive to carry out, because you have to introduce a change. Unlike a drug, which is an experimental drug, introduced by a drug company, here you have to look at the effect of a policy. For example, if you have to look at the effect of, let's say, midday meals in schools, then what you have to do is you have to, within a particular group, a randomized group, you have a treatment group to which you administer midday meals. And then you compare the performance of midday meals on various kinds of outcomes to those who have not received the midday meal. Now, if you want to do this on a large enough scale, then there will always be the issue of cost, because the experiment is quite costly. You have to be able to give scholarships or midday meals or whatever you're trying to look at, that you have to give these to people concerned. So that is something which is, sorry, just a second. Yeah. So that is something which is not very easy to do. Secondly, there are ethical questions, and these ethical questions are actually common to all randomized controlled trials, which is even though you randomize the group to which you give the treatment, but there is still this other group which you do not give a treatment and you give the placebo. And there is an ethical issue of then the fact that you give a treatment to a certain group, an incentive, and you do not give the incentive to another group. So this is the second problem in RCTs. The third basic issue in RCTs is that, most sciences are fairly context specific. Biological sciences are context specific. Medical sciences are also fairly context specific. They're not universal in that sense. But behavioral sciences like economics are extremely context specific. So if you carry out an RCT in a particular situation, then the results could be valid for that situation. But so they may have what we call internal validity, but it's not easy then for us to say whether they will have external validity as well. So will they be also relevant to other situations? Will they also be relevant to other contexts? That is something we cannot say. Now, the methodologies which have been promoted by David Card, Imbens, and Angrist, in a sense, step aside from randomized controlled trials, and they rely on what is known as natural experiments. So now, natural experiments is a strange term, or is a quaint term for the social sciences. So I think one can elaborate it a little bit. What they mean is that they look at actual observations. They look at what is actually been happening, in a particular domain, and they base their research on actual observations. Since their research naturally is looking at the impact of a policy change or a policy variable, what they will be trying to do is to isolate the effect of that policy variable in a context in which it has already taken place. So, for example, uh, uh, India underwent a lockdown in 2000, a very, very severe lockdown in March 2020. This was a policy variable which was introduced. Now, we don't quite know what would have been the case if this policy variable would not have taken place. And the the causal relationship that we might try to explore by setting up an appropriate research design is what would be what was the impact of this lockdown on the kind of outcome variable that we choose to study. And that variable could be national income, it could be employment, or it could be, the health related variables which it was supposed to check, etc. So this is the way, so they're looking at naturally occurring events where a policy variable has intervened. So they have to then, the first step in this exercise to be able to isolate the effect of this naturally occurring, or in this exogenous variable, the policy variable, would be to create appropriate research design. And that appropriate research design must be such that it enables them to measure the impact of that variable. So if that variable were the cause, the exogenous variable, then what would be the effect of that cause? And these are the kind of methodological issues which Card and Angrist and Imbens and others with whom they worked were trying to look at. I'll briefly, go through first through some of the contributions of David Card to try to explain to you how he did it. David Card was, like me, a labor economist. He has contributed to a large number of areas within labor economics. The three main areas of his contributions have been on looking at the impact of changes in minimum wages, and the economics of immigration and the economics of education, where his work overlaps with the work of the other two individuals. So let me give you just two examples of what he tried to do, and where I could draw upon his work and how his work differed from earlier works. So one very celebrated piece of work done by David Card was was his work on the impact of minimum wages, which he did along with Alan Kruger uh, at the University of Princeton. Now, at the classical theory in economics tells us that if markets are working competitively, then any increase in wages would actually lead to a decline in employment. If wages rise, employment would decline. Now, this is a broad, let's say, theory which David Card was empirically trying to test. David Card and Alan Kruger were empirically trying to test, and they did it by creating a research design. This research design was such that, because in the 90s, when they were looking at this issue, the federal minimum wage in the US has a federal minimum wage, in other words, a minimum wage, which is set nationally, but states can set their own minimum wage. Different states can set their own minimum wage. Now, the federal minimum wage had been fixed for over a decade. It had not been changed. But in the period that we are talking about, different states were contemplating an increase in minimum wage. One of these states was the state of New Jersey, which is a relatively small state. And New Jersey was contemplating an increase in minimum wage from $4.75 to $5.05. So 20 cents over the 4.475 cents that it was already there. Okay. Now, this had to go through a process of approval, governmental approval, legislative approval, and so on. So this policy change was imminent. It was about to take place. Uh, because it was about to take place, and because Card and Kruger knew that it was about to take place, they designed a natural experiment. In that natural experiment, they picked an industry which is relatively homogeneous in terms of the product that it delivered, and it has varied other characteristics which made it a suitable candidate for study, and which was the fast food industry. So they picked on, the fast food industry, and they did carried out a survey of over 500 fast food establishments in the state of New Jersey and in the adjoining part of the eastern part of the state of Pennsylvania, which was very much like the state of New Jersey. So the seasonality effect and the broad economic similarities was such that you could control for a large number of characteristics by taking these two adjoining territories, New Jersey and the eastern part of the state of Pennsylvania. And they carried out this detailed survey of employers in both the states, looked at the state of employment, part-time employment, full-time employment, the wages that were being paid in food establishment, in fast food establishments, etc. So they collected data on a number of variables. This survey was carried out in January, February. The increase in minimum wages was implemented in April 1992. They carried out another survey in November, December 1992, where they resurveyed the same establishments. There was a small loss of, a few establishments which had closed, but other than that, they were able to resurvey almost all the establishments that they had surveyed earlier, and they collected the same data. They did data on employment, data on wages, full-time employment, and part-time employment. What they further did was that they bifurcated the establishments in New Jersey into two groups of establishments. One, which were paying earlier than this new minimum. Earlier on, they were paying less than the new minimum wage of $5.05, and establishments which were in any case paying a higher wage. So there were two groups of establishments. And the basic exercise which they wanted to carry out, which they carried out using a large number of checks, to check for the sensitivity and the robustness of their results, was to see, number one, when minimum wages increase in New Jersey, did employment in the fast food joints in New Jersey fall relative to the employment in Eastern Pennsylvania? The answer which they gave was paradoxical. They found that actually employment in New Jersey increased by roughly about 2% over the employment in Eastern Pennsylvania. The second issue which they discussed was, what happened to, there were already existing high wage establishments in New Jersey, and there were these low wage establishments where wages increased. So the other question which they asked was that, did employment shift from high wage establishments to low wage establishments? The increase that took place in low wage establishments in Pennsylvania, did it take place at the expense of the high wage establishments? And the answer which again they gave was no, it did not take place at the expense of high wage establishments. High wage establishments did lose a little bit of employment, but this was in line with the loss in employment which took place in Eastern Pennsylvania. Both the states at that point of time were undergoing recession. So one would expect a certain loss in employment overall, But within this broad scenario of a small loss in employment which the fast food industry suffered, the increase in minimum wages per se did not bring about any decline in employment in New Jersey. Now, this was a very important result, and this showed that wages in the fast food industry were actually not being set competitively. They were not supply driven. That possibly had to do with the structure of the industry. Okay, uh, that industry had some wage setting power by which wages were set at a level below minimum wage, and the increase in minimum wage didn't have a negative impact on employment. Uh, in econometrically, they employed a method which, in fact, Card seminally contributed to, which is known as the difference in difference method. So this was one prominent study where Card uh, through appropriate research design and through an econometric methodology, which is a difference in difference method, was able to demonstrate a very important paradoxical result that the increase in minimum wage did not lead to a decline in employment. And by the way, just for this as an aside, when I was a member of the National Commission for Enterprises in the unorganized sector, and Ruchi referred to that. Uh, uh, the proposals that we made was to institute a national minimum wage in the country. We don't have a legal national minimum wage in the country. Now, of course, the labor code has introduced a minimum wage, which is still being deliberated upon, the level of the minimum wage. And the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was not particularly happy with the proposal. So the chairman of the commission asked me to look very rigorously at issues around the relationship between minimum wage and employment. And that is when I looked at the detailed empirical literature, I thought the Card study was a study which came very handy for me to be able to say, look, an increase in minimum wages in India is not going to have a huge negative effect on employment. Okay, so this is one very important study which Card made. The other study, which again uh, he is very well known for, is what is known as the Mariel boat lift study. The Mariel boat lift study looked at in 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 uh, in the mid 1980s, 1982 actually, the Cuban government allowed its residents to emigrate to the US. And this led to roughly about 125,000 Cuban residents emigrating to the US. And they mostly landed in Miami. After which they dispersed to different counties in different other states. But nonetheless, around 45 to 50,000 immigrants remained in Miami, swelling the labor force in Miami by about 7%. Okay. And the concrete question which then David Card asked was, what was the impact of this immigration on uh, on local labor markets and on wages? Now, this question is a question which again is something of like the minimum wages question, something of very general importance. There is a general belief that large-scale immigration depresses wages, and it is to the disadvantage of local labor. So this is one of the ways, and in fact, this is one of the many studies which Card did on the topic, by which Card tried to look at the impact of immigration on the wages, on the wages of natives. Essentially, what Card did was, number one, he segmented the local labor market, the low skilled labor. Most of the migrants who came in from Cuba were low skilled, and they were Cubans. Now, the low skilled migrants in Miami were in four groups. They were low skilled white migrants, they were low skilled migrants of African descent, they were low skilled Hispanic non-Cuban migrants, and then Cuban migrants. Okay, and essentially it was the Cuban migrants who came in, and the and what Card tried to do was to look at the impact of this immigration on these four groups of pre-existing natives. The earlier, cohorts of Cuban immigrants, the earlier cohorts of other Hispanic immigrants, the the natives of Black African descent, and the white natives. And once again, in a very carefully, and he chose as a control group states with a similar composition, with a similar economic and demographic composition as the state of Miami. Okay, to see how wages were moving in these other four states. So he looked at, on the one hand, he compared wages within Miami. On the other hand, he compared the trends in wages in Miami to the trends in the other four states. And by doing a set of careful econometric exercises, he was able to show that indeed the wages of that this wave of immigration, the Mariel boat lift, as it is called, of Cuban immigration in Miami, did not depress the wages of natives, of black and white natives. He broadly then goes on to give two explanations. One is that the Miami was already uh, the industrial structure of Miami was such that it was ready to absorb the kind of immigrant labor that had come in through the Mariel boat lift, and therefore it did not lead to any decline in wages in Miami relative to other regions, the control regions that he was looking at. Secondly, there was also some outflow of the population from Miami to other regions, whites and native populations, which also would have counteracted any possible negative impact on wages. So again, this is one of the studies. There were many other studies on the economics of immigration which Card carried out, both of which together went on to show that actually the immigration does not impact negatively on the wages of natives uh, in the same bracket, in the low skill bracket. Now, methodologically, as I said, this basically consisted of creating a research design. And once you created a research design, coming up with an appropriate methodology by which you could look at the counterfactual situation and be able to make a definite causal relationship. Now, this whole exercise, this methodological contribution was carried much further by Angrist and Imbens in two different ways, which I'll describe very briefly. One is they again both of them their methodological contributions were also to the same kind of natural experiments, and largely their papers, as I have told you, were around the economics of immigration. The classic paper which they wrote was about basically whether compulsory recruitment. There were several papers which they have written with co-contributors in major American journals. But one of the classic papers which they wrote was that, at that point of time, America still had a compulsory draft into the army. The question that they were asking was that what was the impact of this draft of conscription into the army on eventual returns that people got. They did depress once they were released from the draft and they went back to join the labor market. Then, how depressed would their wages be relative to other people in the population who had not joined the draft? So this was one question. They asked a whole series of questions around the same methodological concerns. Now, what they did was again to simulate some kind of an experiment based on these natural observations, uh, using two methodologies. One, in one set of experiments, they use what is known as a regression discontinuity, or an RD, and this was sometimes combined with, or the other methodology was used independently, which is what they called the the local average treatment effect, or late. Okay, so very briefly, just to explain why late was a methodological innovation, was that and how it relates to the rest of the contributions that I've talked about. Essentially, essentially assume that there was a way of assigning people to the army, uh, which was random, so that people who were drafted into the army were drafted in randomly. And this actually, basically, the America did use some kind of a lottery to assign people to the army. Okay. So the question was that some people were drafted into the army, some people were given the draft to join the army. Some people were not given to draft to join the army. But uh, and the question was then to, of course, if this was a straightforward question, one could look at one could compare the drafters to the non-drafters, and to then come up with the conclusion as to what their returns later on returns to employment were in the economy. But this was complicated by the fact that many of the drafters would not join, and many of the people voluntarily joined the army. Okay, so basically, you, instead of getting just two groups, actually, they demonstrated that you would get not two but four groups, and eventually they developed this late theorem to be able to isolate the effect of the groups that whose impact they wanted to compare, which is the people who were asked to join the army and joined, and people who were not asked to join the army and did not join. So basically, this was the group known as the compliers, and within the group of compliers, they developed they looked at the what would be the average treatment effect, the local average, what they call the local average treatment effect, or late, in order to be, because each individual they cannot measure what the counterfactual would be for each individual who joined the army, having been asked to join the army. There, that counterfactual does not exist, so they actually found a way of estimating the average treatment effect, the local average treatment effect, for the group of compliers, by isolating it from the group of people who would join the army on their own, or people who would not join the army even if they were asked to join it. Okay, so this was the method which they called the methodological contribution, which they called late, which they used extensively in a large number of studies to be able to initiate the effect of conscription, of school quality, of school enrollments, and many other contributions. So essentially, in a nutshell, this is what uh, the contributions of Card and Ingress and Angrist and Imbens have been, which is to methodologically contribute to causal relationships. Now, there are several questions here, which is why I said, which I gave this title to my talk, is that, uh, you know, how do you, even if you, first of all, they create a research design by which each of these exercises, the late theorem is based on a certain number of assumptions. Okay. Uh, so each of these exercises is based on a certain number of assumptions. Now, in order that these assumptions are plausible, that you can apply them, you need to have an appropriate research design. Now, so far, so good. You have an appropriate research design. Once you have an appropriate research design, you can see how plausible these assumptions are. And if these assumptions appear to be plausible enough, then you can empirically test the validity. You can empirically test whether what would be the treatment effect, what would be the policy impact of each of these variables. Uh, Having done that, of course, the question here is that your estimates, the estimates that you find out would still have internal validity. They would be valid for a set of observations. Now, from that set of observations, you have to first move to the larger group, and then you have to move to other contexts, other contexts. So, internal validity, methodologically, internal validity is still something which is easy to test. External validity is something which is far more difficult to test in the social sciences and in economics with models like this. And external validity becomes all the more difficult to test in economics because the social behavior and human behavior and the overall societal context is constantly itself under change. So if I were to conclude, I would say that the non-negative conclusions, I mean, that you get from many of these results. I mean, let us look at, for example, when Card says that an increase in minimum wages, his results show that an increase in minimum wages actually increased employment in fast food establishments in New Jersey. So there can be a weaker form of this hypothesis, which says that an increase in minimum wages does not necessarily bring about a decrease in employment. Now, this is something which one can assert on the basis of the kind of experiments, natural experiments, which Card and Angress and Imbens have carried out. But the converse, which is that an increase in minimum wages would necessarily bring about an increase in employment, is not something one can assert uh, in different contexts. So the external validity of that result may or may not hold. That is something which I think remains a problem when you have methodological issues, important methodological innovations such as the ones which this group has contributed in along with its thing. But nonetheless, one must recognize that for us as scientists, as social scientists, the study of causal relationships remains an extremely important concern. And the contributions made by this trio, along with many of their co-authors, in that sense is a very important contribution. What it is limited by is the nature of economics as a social science. So I'll stop here, and then we can deal with some discussion and questions.
Very interesting talk. And as you started by distinguishing between RCTC and RCTS and natural experiments. Am I audible, Dr. Sahu? So, as taking us through the entire journey of the methodological innovation being made by Professor Card and others. So it's been very, very insightful. Now, I request my colleagues if they have any questions till they're putting their thoughts together. I have one query, sir. So you emphasize the role of the research design.
Before I do that, can you just direct? I mean, for some reason I can't see anybody else on the video. Maybe you're not in video, or maybe sometimes that I use WebEx. So what do I do to do that? View something in view? No. View participant video. Okay, that's all that one can have. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. That's
So,
better.
yes, sir. So, since you emphasize the role of this research design and coming up with the counters in the particular research question. So, is there a certain framework which is available in terms of what do you define an appropriate research design? I mean, so that once you meet those parameters, you know that, okay, this, we need to do this. So that was my question.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the point, the kind of research design you would have is really dictated by the methodological issues, the methodological concerns that you have. Now, in the case, for example, if you look at the card study uses a difference in difference method. Primarily, it uses a difference method. Now, in order to use a difference in difference method, what they need is a set of comparisons which they can make. And in order to make that set of comparisons, they look at a control region which has the characters which is very much like the characteristics of the treatment region. Okay, so they're very similar. These two regions are very similar. Two regions are very similar. The food industry characteristics in both the regions are very similar. Uh, you don't need to account for that in your result. You don't need to account for the difference. The seasonality effect is similar across the two regions. And then they introduce a whole set of other controls and econometric tests to check the sensitivity and the robustness of the results. Okay. Now, in the late theories, in all those designs where the late theorem is used, again, depending on how it is used, you would, for example, uh, many of these this depend, basically they're based on an instrumental variable design. Initially, what the instrument will do it will allocate the population into two binary groups. Ideally, this allocation should be done randomly. Okay, or it should iterate to a random rule. Okay, if it iterates to a random rule, then the exogeneity assumption of the instrument variable will hold. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that yes, the research design is important, but it would be dictated by the methodological concerns that you have, the methodological framework that you propose to follow.
Others may raise their hand, and as Dr. Sau suggested, we can unmute them and they can ask the question.
I noticed a comment somewhere, I thought.
Is it Dr. Sau has written that in case if they want to.
Okay, okay.
Because we have our colleagues from the economics discipline.
Yes, sure.
As a researcher, it's always easy if you have a certain framework given. But as you said that having it will depend upon your like methodological concern of that particular study that you need to kind of look at
research design.
the research.
Will it is built in conjunction with the kind of research this thing that you wish to follow, the methodological framework that you wish to follow.
And another concern was like you mentioned that there was this context, like for instance, suppose, in fact, we have seen some recent studies which they make use of this policy experiment in India about the liberalization and privatization, how that whether that has impacted the innovation or other behavior by the companies in terms of have they become more innovative or whether their productivity has increased or not. So in order to kind of like take your argument further, like make it a bit more context free. I mean, do we need to undertake more research with different contexts, or there are certain other parameters given or even tests there so that we can have more to say with respect to the context?
So exactly, I mean, typically this is what economists do, and this is what within the kind of the kind of methodological concerns that we have been talking about in this lecture. For example, if you look at the RCT studies, this is exactly what Abhijit and Esther, etc., have done over a period of time. they've used RCTs on some similar sets of issues across different contexts. Africa, within the South Asian context, to look at, for example, let's say midday meals. Okay, what impact midday meals would have on school enrollments, or on nutritions, or any other or let's say conditional transfers, their impacts. So the one way of doing this is to actually to reduce the context specificity, would to be able to carry out that same experiment across different contexts. That's one way of doing it. But I think that this eternally remains a challenge. Yeah, because the context uh, is changeable all the time. It is historically contingent. It is socially contingent. Therefore, this we have to recognize in the economic sciences that this will always remain a challenge. That's why I said the weaker hypothesis is always, it's easier to state that upfront. It's easier to say that, confirm that, than to say that, well, this is bound to happen. It's easier to say that this may not happen, or this need not necessarily happen.
And last thing, like in terms of some of us involved in this kind of work, and some of the new PhD students. So in terms of their research methodology, I mean, and in Indian context, I think we are very used to getting a secondary data and using it in certain software packages. I think, is it time to move ahead and look beyond that very typical form of regression models which we have gotten very used to and very comfortable with? So your comment on that would be.
Yeah, I mean, all these things now, as you know, experimental economics, behavioral economics are making their way now into PhD programs and RCTs, etc. So they are making their way into Indian academia as well. One of the issues here is that our data is much more limited. For example, if you look at the some of the data which David Card uses.
Yes.
In the immigration studies, which is from the population studies, which is from the census. Now, the census there makes you available micro data, it makes you available micro panel data, which is collected regularly. Okay. So the data which is available in different countries, and including the United States, the UK, is far more richer than the data that we have. That enables them to also carry out the same kind of research, where we are restricted by the kind of data that we have. But yes, we don't need to entirely emulate the research which is happening. One of the problems is that our research, the mainstream research is very dominated by what happens within the US, because the US academic industry is colossal. It is absolutely colossal. So, but the fact is that we do need to move ahead and look at the problems, and how do we solve them. And in that context, yes, we are moving forward. For example, a lot of people are also now using unconventional data sets, large data sets, machine learning, and people at IITs are more equipped to actually do interdisciplinary research using those kind of data sets than maybe people who are in university systems or in social science institutes.
Thank you very much, sir. I think if there are no more questions, we would like to close the session. So, Dr. Sahu, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Ruchi, if you allow me, because nobody's asking.
Please go ahead.
I'm going to frame a question.
No, sure.
So, for example, the findings of these laureates, economic laureates of last year, Card et al. So, what is the applicability? Have they done a study related to different demography? For example, their findings, how can I apply to our Indian demography? Because our economy is different, our lifestyle is different, education is different. So these factors, how these are affecting the findings? Because making a case study in Miami or New Jersey will be definitely different compared to making a study in Indian context, and particularly if you can bring the interventions like the lockdown and all that, what we saw, the immigration problem within the country. So
Yes.
what is your comment on that? So I was just trying to frame the problem because I am a physicist. So, okay,
No,
thank you.
you're absolutely right. And this is exactly what I was trying to get at. Uh, in fact, their work is very US centric. Is very US centric. In fact, if you look at the work on economics, for example, the economics of education, uh, you would not be able to relate to it. Simply because the kind of school systems they talk about, the kind of school enrollment systems they talk about, okay, they just don't exist in India. We don't have anything in parallel to that at all. Absolutely. There's seminal papers on, for example, on compulsory schooling or on drafts and returns to schooling. You can't relate to it because nothing of that kind. And actually, 60% of the work of these three is in areas around these issues. On the economics of education, there is Card has himself actually carried out some work which includes the US and also North Europe. But that's it. Okay, the comparison with Germany, Scandinavia, and so on, and so it's an interesting. I mean, but again, it's a small set of countries, right, in the northern hemisphere over which this work has been carried out. Minimum wage again is very specific to a set of areas, and we don't have anything of that kind because we don't also have the same. The thing with minimum wages is that the degree of compliance of minimum wages is far higher in the US than in India. Even in situations where we have minimum wages, we have agricultural minimum wages which are never this thing. So, to that extent, the kind of studies that we need to design and the way we need to look at the studies is absolutely very different in the Indian context. So, also a database. I think the broad thing is, first of all, they have given us some methodological tools which are sophisticated, which are important, which draw the attention back to the whole question of causal relationships, away from large models onto specific areas. Uh, to that extent, I think there is applicability, but we have to customize these things much further to the Indian context. That's
Right.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Because you see, as I can see now, I am sitting in France. The schools are open. When in the French territory, the COVID cases per day is almost 2.5 lakhs. The
Yes.
schools are open. Schools are mandatory. Even we are afraid of sending the kids to the school. We have to send it. It's compulsory.
Hmm.
So I understand, I agree with you. The Indian context is completely different. Bringing up any economic model to Indian territory will be really difficult. But okay, thank you so much. It was really eye-opening talk. So, Binay, any question in the YouTube?
He mentioned Anand, I think. He's already mentioned that in the chat.
Okay. So if there is no more questions, so I think it is time to close the session with a big thanks to Professor
Thank you.
Srivastava.
Thank you.
It was essentially, across the territories of subjects, it was really eye-opening talk. At least I could understand to good extent being a physicist. So I believe the future viewers in YouTube and also when we archive this in our outreach website, so many people will be benefited. So from our team of Institute Outreach, so I extend my hearty thanks to Professor Srivastava for sparing his valuable time out of the busy schedule with all of us. And we look forward to see you in the campus once Corona situation is better, because that will give us a broader platform to discuss, with faculty members and students across the tea table maybe. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and
Thank you very much.
great interacting with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks.
And for the viewers, we resume our session at 4 o'clock, little before 4 o'clock, maybe 5 minutes before, with the chemistry talk for Nobel Prize 2021. Thank you so much. See you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sabina, is it fine to close the session and resume at around 3:55?
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. See you. Thank you.